Well, I feel badly for General Flynn. I feel very badly. He's led a very strong life.
Michael Flynn, General Flynn, is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media.
Are you going to pardon Michael Flynn?
Well, he's got a case going on right now. I think he would. I don't know this for a fact, but I think he's doing very well with respect to his case. I hope that he's going to be able to win it. And I don't have a decision to make until I find out what's going to happen.
We're back with the breaking news that Donald Trump has just moments ago tweeted that he has issued a full pardon of General Michael Flynn. Mike Flynn pleaded guilty twice in a court of law to lying to the FBI. He was awaiting sentencing where Bill Barr's Justice Department, a move that alienated career prosecutors who quit the case, was seeking to have that case dismissed. And before it could be reviewed and adjudicated, Donald Trump today issuing a full pardon to Mike Flynn. Joining our conversation now is Sam Stein, politics editor at the Daily Beast. Also joining us, Mara Gay, member of the New York Times editorial board, and my longtime friend, Steve Schmidt, former Republican strategist and co-founder of the Lincoln Project. Steve Schmidt, I start with you on the breaking news.
Well, it's not surprising that we've entered the corrupt pardons phase of the Trump coup against the American election at all. Look, not a surprise. Doesn't matter, though, for General Flynn, whether he's pardoned or not. He disgraced himself. This was a lieutenant general in the United States Army, and his colleagues, the people he spent his life serving with, all know the magnitude of his disgrace, the defilement of his oath, of his duty, and no presidential pardon takes that away.
You know, Sam Stein, what's striking, we came on the air today with this remarkable call for patience from the American people to do the right things in terms of protecting ourselves and our loved ones from the coronavirus this holiday weekend and this winter. We played it alongside a Tony Fauci interview from this morning where he basically says the same thing. And for a president, a lame duck president in Donald Trump, who's trying to claim that the election was won by him, he's the one acting like he has no interest in actually leading this country. And Joe Biden, ahead of his actual inauguration, has already, I think, moved into the leadership role for this country in terms of speaking about the country and not himself, in terms of acting and looking and sounding presidential instead of calling in on an iPhone to a microphone at a shady hearing in a state that's already certified its results for Joe Biden. I mean, the split screen is that the president-elect is the president and Donald Trump is acting like a two-bit criminal.
Yeah, I think the contrast, the split screen, as you said, was really profound today. I mean, having the president of the United States, a man who can go anywhere and turn anything into a stage, who has the bully pulpit of the office, reduced to having to call into a cell phone, put on speaker, held up to a microphone in a conference room in a Wyndham Hotel in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in front of a bunch of state lawmakers and massless conspiracy theorists, while Joe Biden is giving this address. That's quite the contrast. And it does suggest that these two men are on very different trajectories. One sort of holding on for dear life against all logic and odds in reality, and the other ready to presume the office of the presidency. The pardon news does show, though, that there are several weeks left for Trump to act within his powers and to do what he's done throughout his presidency, which is to utilize the levers and powers of the office, often for either personal gain or for personal political gain. This is not going to be the only pardon, nor will it be the only pardon of an associate close to Trump who's become sort of a hero cult-like figure on the right. And the only thing I'll just add about the Flynn thing is this is an embodiment of how Trump has turned government on its head. Flynn lied not just to the FBI, but to Vice President Mike Pence. He was fired because he was not truthful to Vice President Mike Pence. That type of deception would normally not endear you to the president. But Trump has made every issue into sort of a referendum on himself. And by the end of this saga, whether or not you supported a pardon for Michael Flynn became a litmus test as to whether or not you supported Donald Trump personally. And so, of course, he was pardoned because Trump felt like it was a personal referendum.
Yeah, and I mean, Margay, to Sam's point, I know that we aren't surprised because Donald Trump has conditioned us to expect nothing but sort of the gutter, to be blunt about what he does. But we should all be shocked that a man who assumed the role of this country's national security advisor, he didn't work for Donald Trump, he worked for us. He was in charge of our national security. It's a job held by people who've gone on to be the Secretary of State and Defense Secretary who have made important decisions and given advice to presidents at vital moments of our country. This national security advisor, as Sam just said, lied not just to the FBI, but to the vice president. And today he got a full pardon from Donald Trump. I want to read you what Adam Schiff had to say about it. Let me put it up if we have that. Congressman Schiff said, quote, "It's no surprise that Trump would go out just as he came in, crooked to the end."
Yeah, we should be shocked, but we should also be prepared because I think, unfortunately, this is the tip of the iceberg. I do expect that we will see a full bevy of pardons, if not for himself personally, which is, I think, another major concern, then certainly for those around him. We found that the vast majority of pardons this president has made so far have been to those with whom he is personally connected or has reaped some benefit from, certainly not on behalf of justice or the American people, God forbid. I think it's important to know that there are actually limits to presidential pardon power, and those should really be strictly enforced. One of those limits, of course, is that the president cannot pardon people for state crimes, and that includes himself, of course. And then, the other is that, and Attorney General William Barr actually testified to this, right, which is that if a president does pardon someone and it's later found that that is actually tampering with a judicial proceeding, that can be an obstruction of justice, a criminal offense. So that's a concern. And I think more broadly speaking, to your point, Nicole, we may not be surprised. We should remain shocked because it's a moral outrage. But it really reminds me of something that Martin Luther King said in one of his sermons years ago. He said, "Never forget that everything that was done in Nazi Germany was legal." And really, I think that is true of so much of this presidency. But this is the most explicit example before us today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.